My name is Bella, and I never thought opening my home to family would turn into my biggest mistake. When my brother and his wife lost their apartment, I welcomed them in with their kids. It was supposed to be temporary, but over time, they started acting like it was their house, demanding the best of everything while barely paying rent. The breaking point came one evening when I discovered my little girl's belongings shoved into the attic so their daughter could take her room. That night, I smiled at my daughter and quietly said, "Pack your bags." If you're watching, let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, here's how it all began. When my brother Daniel called me late one evening and said they had 30 days to move out, my first instinct was to help. He explained that their landlord had sold the property and they couldn't find a new place quickly. I had a 2-bedroom house with a finished attic. It wasn't huge, but I thought we could make it work. I told him right away they could stay with me until they found another rental. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. Family looks out for each other, and I believed they would appreciate the lifeline. We agreed they would help with expenses while they were there. My mortgage, utilities, and other bills totaled well over $2,000 a month. Daniel promised they could put in a few hundred toward groceries and give me a small amount for rent until they were back on their feet. It wasn't equal, but I told myself I could carry most of the weight for a short while because I had steady work as a medical assistant and could manage if it was temporary. The first couple of weeks went smoothly. My niece and my daughter loved playing together, and the house felt full but lively. I was hopeful it wouldn't take long before Daniel and his wife, Erica, found their new place. I kept encouraging them, reminding Erica about rental listings I had seen online. She always had a reason to dismiss them. Too small, too expensive, not in the right neighborhood. I brushed it off in the beginning, figuring she was just stressed. Weeks turned into months, and nothing changed. Instead of looking for apartments, they settled into my home as if it were their own. Their contribution remained the same, a little toward utilities, a little toward food. But I was still paying everything else. More than once, I caught myself doing the math in my head. My hours spent working extra shifts so the bills could be covered, compared to their minimum efforts. At first, they seemed grateful, but small things began to shift. I came home one weekend to find that the living room furniture had been rearranged completely. They claimed it worked better for family time. My daughter's art supplies, which she kept neatly in a basket on the coffee table, had been moved into her bedroom because they said the space looked too messy. I never gave permission for any of it, but I told myself it wasn't worth starting tension. But then I found something that made my blood boil. My daughter's prized watercolor painting, the one she'd spent 3 weeks perfecting for her art class and had proudly displayed on the refrigerator, was crumpled in the kitchen trash. When I asked about it, Erica shrugged and said her daughter had accidentally spilled juice on it while reorganizing the kitchen wall to make space for her own child's soccer certificates and honor roll awards. That same week, I discovered something even worse. Erica had ordered a $200 ergonomic gaming chair for her daughter using my Amazon account, claiming it was accidentally saved from when she borrowed my laptop to apply for jobs. She justified it by saying her daughter needed proper back support for online schoolwork. Meanwhile, my own daughter had been asking for months if we could replace her broken desk chair, the rickety one, with a wobbly wheel that made her homework time uncomfortable. But I kept saying we needed to wait because money was tight while I was supporting 4 extra people. Then Erica started treating shared spaces like they were under her control. She would set up her laptop on the dining table and announce that no one could sit there because she was busy with work, even though all I ever saw were online shopping pages and social media scrolling. Daniel piled up tools in my garage to the point where I could barely park my car. It felt like the walls of my own home were closing in on me. Still, I excused it all. My go-to thought was always, they're family, they need support. My daughter tried to accept it too, but I could sense her unease. She would ask me if she still had permission to invite her best friend over, since the living room always seemed occupied by Erica and her daughter. More often than not, I told her we'd wait for another day, realizing, little by little, our routines were shrinking. It didn't take long before subtle signs of entitlement turned into open behavior that made me feel like I was no longer the one in control of my own household. Daniel and Erica began acting as though the house belonged to them, creating rules that didn't include me. One night, I returned from work, eager to relax in the living room, only to find the doors closed and locked. When I asked what was going on, Erica casually explained it was family movie night and that they didn't want to be disturbed. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I realized I wasn't considered part of this family gathering, despite being the person providing a roof over their heads. Moments like that became more frequent. On nights when I cooked dinner after a long shift, Erica would point out that my meals were a little heavy for their taste, or she would fuss about the seasoning not being what her daughter preferred. I spent my life trying to make sure my daughter had warm, home-cooked meals, but in my own kitchen, I was suddenly treated like an amateur cook who didn't meet their standards. When I asked Daniel once if they could wash the dishes after a meal, he laughed and said he'd been working on job applications all day and needed to rest. Erica added that cleaning up afterward was my thing, since I enjoyed cooking. That word, enjoyed, struck me. As if preparing food and scrubbing plates for 4 adults and 2 children was some kind of hobby I had volunteered for, rather than basic household work that everyone should pitch in on. The strain deepened when Erica's attitude toward my daughter became impossible to ignore. She would make small comments that seemed harmless if you only heard one, but together they painted a clear picture. When my daughter proudly showed a drawing she had spent hours working on, Erica dismissed it by saying, "Your cousin is more into sports. Not all kids are artistic." Another time, when our girls came down wearing pajamas, Erica laughed and said her daughter looked like a model while muttering that my child wasn't as put together. It was always said in a casual tone, with a smile, but it cut through me. My daughter noticed it. Her shoulders would droop, her excitement fading, and she started spending more time in her room instead of in the shared spaces she used to love. But what really broke my heart was what happened with my daughter's clarinet. She had been taking lessons for 2 years, practicing diligently every afternoon at 4 p.m. It was her one consistent joy, something that made her face light up when she pulled out her music sheets. But Erica started complaining that the noise interrupted her daughter's online tutoring sessions, which, coincidentally, she scheduled right during my daughter's practice time. She demanded my daughter stop playing until they found their own place. When I stood my ground about the clarinet practice, explaining that music was important for my daughter's development and emotional well-being, I found the instrument hidden in the basement the next day. Erica claimed her daughter had borrowed it to try learning, but somehow it ended up buried behind old holiday boxes where an 8-year-old couldn't possibly reach it on her own. Then came the text messages that made me see red. My daughter showed me her phone one evening, with tears streaming down her face. Her cousin had been sending messages like, "My mom says this house is too small for both of us," and "You should ask your mom when you're moving out, so I can finally have a real bedroom instead of sharing." These weren't innocent childhood comments. They were clearly coached statements designed to make my daughter feel unwelcome and insecure in her own home. My work hours were long, and I often came home exhausted. Instead of walking into a space that felt comforting, I walked into tension. Dishes stacked in the sink, toys belonging to my niece scattered in every corner, and Erica setting new boundaries I had never agreed to. When it came time to address money, the excuses poured out. Daniel explained that his hours were cut. Erica insisted buying groceries for their daughter counted as more than enough contribution. If I mentioned fairness, they reminded me I had a steady job and could afford to cover things for now. They flipped my willingness to help into an obligation as though my effort was expected, not appreciated. Yet through all of this, I didn't explode or argue. I remained calm, though inside I was boiling. Part of me thought maybe if I stayed steady, they would recognize how far they'd gone and step back. Instead, each week, they embedded themselves further, moving objects around the house as if organizing it all according to their taste. Family photos were pushed aside to make room for Erica's decorations. At dinner, she insisted her daughter should always sit at the center, the best seat, leaving my child off to the side. These changes seemed symbolic, but in reality, they represented my quiet removal from the authority of my own space. But what they didn't know was that while they were playing house with my home, I was quietly planning something that would change everything. While they stirred drama in my home, I had been quietly working on something they couldn't see. Every extra shift I picked up at the clinic wasn't just for bills. It was money going into a separate savings account I'd opened without telling anyone. Week after week, I built up enough to cover closing costs and the beginnings of a new start. Each paycheck brought us closer to freedom, though they assumed I was just struggling to keep up with their demands. I sat through bank appointments on my lunch breaks, filled out mortgage applications during late nights after work, and toured properties on weekends while they thought I was simply running errands. These steps, invisible to them, were my silent victories. The loan officer became familiar with my situation, not the dramatic details, but enough to understand that I needed a fresh start for my daughter and myself. The hardest part was keeping this secret from my daughter. After the clarinet incident and those cruel text messages, she started asking when things would go back to normal, her voice small and hopeful that I could restore some sense of balance. I reassured her, even when I didn't believe the situation would fix itself through their sudden consideration. She would hug me extra tight on nights when the tension was particularly thick, and I had to fight back tears, knowing that I was carrying the solution but couldn't share it until everything was secured. I hadn't breathed a word of it to my daughter until everything was locked in place. I didn't want to give her hope too soon or confuse her with changes that weren't set in stone. The worst thing would have been to promise her relief and then have something fall through, leaving her more disappointed than before. So I carried the weight of her hurt, along with the secret that everything was about to turn around, but only when the papers were signed and our victory was guaranteed. The weight of it built slowly. I was paying most of the bills, working myself weary, yet every decision around the house seemed dictated by people who contributed the least. My daughter felt it just as strongly. She started asking when things would go back to normal, her voice small, carrying the hope that I could restore some sense of balance. I reassured her, even when I didn't believe the situation would fix itself. Day by day, I felt less like the homeowner and more like an unwanted guest within my own walls. My child felt pushed to the edges, her laughter more subdued. I kept my composure on the outside, but inside the line was nearing its limit. Each critique, each dismissal, and each new rule led me closer to the point where even quiet endurance would no longer be possible. I hadn't said the words yet, but I was preparing myself. They thought they had control of my house, but they hadn't seen how far I would go once I reached that breaking point. When I walked into the house that afternoon, I noticed right away that something was off. My daughter's bedroom door was slightly open, and the shelves where she usually kept her books looked bare from the hallway. When I stepped inside, I saw her belongings stacked in cardboard boxes, clothes folded in a hurry, drawings torn from the wall instead of carefully taken down. Her small desk chair, the broken one she used to sit on while coloring after school, was gone. It didn't take long to realize what had happened, because when I looked around, the bed itself was missing too. I followed the sound of quiet shuffling upstairs, past the second floor and up the narrow steps we never usually used. The attic wasn't a finished space. It had thin floorboards laid across beams, insulation exposed in places, a smell of dust and mildew in the air. Boxes of old holiday decorations and unused furniture had always been stored up there. The light was dim, even with the bulb turned on, casting long shadows over the clutter. In the far corner sat my daughter, her knees pulled up under her chin, a small pile of her favorite stuffed animals gathered beside her. She looked confused, like she wanted to ask a question, but didn't know why this had happened to her in the first place. I froze at the sight. The attic was no place for an 8-year-old to sleep. The floor dipped in spots, nails poked out along the edges of warped wood, the only window barely opened, and the air was thick and stale. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a storage space. And now it was being forced on my child as if it were good enough for her. The very spot I wouldn't let her play in for fear she'd get hurt was where she had been told to move her things. When I turned, Erica was standing behind me with her arms crossed. She didn't even look apologetic. Instead, she said in a calm but sharp voice that her own daughter deserved the larger bedroom my child had been using because she's older and needs her space. The way the words came out, like a simple fact, added a deeper sting. There had been no discussion, no request. They had simply gone into my child's room, packed it up, and claimed it as though the final decision belonged to them. I glanced back at my daughter, sitting among boxes that made her safe space feel like garbage stacked in storage, and the weight of their cruelty hit me. Her eyes looked so heavy, too heavy for a child. She didn't argue or shout. She just sat there, as though she understood something had been taken from her without any power to stop it. All of the little injustices that came before, the rearranging of furniture, the dismissive comments, the locked living room, the destroyed artwork, the hidden clarinet, the cruel texts were suddenly nothing compared to this. They had crossed into a place I couldn't excuse again, but in that moment, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell Erica everything I thought of her arrogance. Instead, I took a deep breath, walked across the attic to my daughter, put my hand gently on her shoulder, and said, "Pack your bags." My voice was calm, steady, almost too quiet for the tension in the room. I knew exactly what I was doing. Erica smirked. To her, those words sounded like surrender. In her mind, I was finally giving in, preparing to leave my own home in shame. The gleam in her eyes confirmed it. She thought she had won. She thought she had pushed me to my limit and forced us out. Also, her child could inherit more space than mine. What she didn't know was that in those two words, I wasn't giving her anything. I wasn't backing down. That moment, standing in the dust and shadows of the attic with my daughter's dignity scattered in boxes, was the exact point where everything shifted. I had reached my breaking point, and rather than crumble, I felt stronger. The plan that had been quietly taking shape in my mind now had urgency, direction, and purpose. They had no idea that the calmness I showed was not defeat. It was the beginning of the end for their hold on my home. That night, I decided to make dinner as if nothing unusual had happened earlier. The kitchen smelled of garlic and onions sizzling in a pan, and I put out plates like it was any other evening we shared a meal. From the outside, it must have looked like a normal family dinner, but inside, I was steadying myself. I wasn't there to keep the peace. I was waiting for the right moment. Daniel and Erica came to the table with the same smug confidence they had carried for months. Erica's posture said everything. She sat down like she owned the place, spreading out as though the dining table had always been hers. Daniel looked relaxed, too, like a man who believed there would be no consequences for his inaction and excuses. Their daughter climbed into the center seat again, the one Erica had insisted was her spot, while my own child sat quietly on the edge, her face unreadable. Watching them carry on, so sure of my silence, made me more certain. I kept my voice calm and cheerful. I passed food around and asked if anyone wanted seconds. My smile didn't slip once, even when I caught Erica's satisfied look on her face. She thought the attic incident had closed the matter. In her mind, I had folded, and everything from that night forward would play out on her terms. She had no idea what I had been preparing behind the scenes, the decisions that had already been set in motion. For the past several months, while they stirred drama in my home, I had been quietly pushing forward with a plan to free myself and my daughter. Every extra shift I picked up at the clinic wasn't just for bills. It was money going into savings. Week after week, I built up enough to cover closing costs and the beginnings of a new start. I sat through bank appointments on my lunch breaks, filled out mortgage applications during late nights after work, and toured properties on weekends while they thought I was simply running errands. These steps, invisible to them, were my silent victories. I hadn't breathed a word of it to my daughter until everything was secure. I didn't want to give her hope too soon or confuse her with changes that weren't set in stone. The hardest part was carrying her hurt after the attic incident without explaining that everything was about to turn around. But when it came to protecting her, keeping secrets felt like the safest gift I could give. She would know the truth only when it was time to celebrate, never in the fragile stage where disappointment could still crush her. At the table that night, the mood seemed one-sided. They laughed and chatted easily, like people with no doubts about their place. Erica cut into her food with the air of someone convinced she had climbed to the top of the household. I could see my daughter lowering her eyes, choosing not to look directly at her cousin, the imbalance weighing heavily on her. Even in silence, that tension was obvious, though they mistook it as proof of their control. I carried myself like the host I had always been, attentive and polite, but underneath, I knew what was coming. I had structured everything carefully, ensuring that the timing, the money, and the paperwork all lined up. I'd already signed the documents for a new house, a brighter, bigger place with extra rooms for both of us to finally breathe again. Compared to what waited for us, the cramped attic and the constant disrespect felt even smaller, almost laughable. Letting them feel secure was part of the satisfaction. Their arrogance stretched wide enough to blind them, making them believe I was powerless. Erica's confidence was so overblown that she set herself up for the fall without realizing it. Every small smirk across the table, every self-satisfied glance only stacked the moment higher. The higher they lifted themselves, the harder the impact would be once reality arrived, and I was patient enough to let them build their own pedestal before it all collapsed. After we finished the main course and began passing around dessert, they were so settled into their false sense of victory that the room practically vibrated with it. And while they reveled in the idea that they had forced me into silence, all I felt was anticipation, because soon that silence was going to end in the last way they expected. When I finally set down my fork and folded my hands on the table, everyone else seemed to pause, without realizing they had. I spoke slowly, in a formal tone I had not used with them before, making sure their focus didn't drift, for even a second. I began by thanking them for sitting down with me that evening, a deliberate choice, since it sounded more like a speech than casual conversation. Their eyes lifted to me, confused, waiting for the words they expected. Erica's smile widened, convinced the announcement was coming. And then, with the same even tone I had practiced in my head many times, I told them the truth. The truth that wasn't at all what they imagined. I had closed on a new home, one bigger and better than this one, with 2 extra bedrooms, one for myself and one just for my daughter. The silence that fell around the table was heavier than the floor beneath us. Erica's smirk dropped from her face almost instantly. Her fork slipped against her plate with a faint scrape, the sound loud in a moment when no one was breathing. Daniel looked at me like he hadn't understood the words. He mouthed a question, but nothing came out. I glanced at my daughter, and I will never forget the way her eyes widened, then softened. The moment she realized that she wasn't being pushed aside at all, she wasn't losing her space. She was stepping into something far better. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or point blame. I didn't need to. I calmly explained that the papers were already signed, that our things would begin moving the following week, and that the arrangement we had here would not continue. Each word landed with more weight than the last, not because I shouted them, but because they were undeniable facts. I could almost see Erica scrambling in her mind, trying to piece together what this meant for her. Without me, they had no place to stay. Without my support, there was no safety net. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and let the silence stretch a beat longer. Then I said it. I closed on a new house, bigger, brighter, with a room just for my daughter. We'll be moving out next week, which means your lease here ends with mine. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then it hit. Erica's smirk shattered. Her jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles twitch, her fork slipping from her fingers and clattering against the plate. Daniel's face went pale, as if every ounce of blood drained from it at once. He blinked fast, trying to find words, but none came. You bought a house? He finally stammered, his voice cracking. Where are we supposed to go now? I tilted my head, calm, unhurried. The same way I found a solution, you'll find one too. After all, I managed it while paying all the bills for your family. I'm sure you'll figure something out. The words landed like bricks, each one heavier than the last. Erica's mouth twisted, her eyes darting in panic. Then she blurted out, her voice shrill and desperate. You can't just throw us out like this. My daughter, she's finally comfortable here. You owe us more time. That's when I stood. I slid my chair back slowly, the scrape of the legs cutting through the silence like a gavel striking. With my hand resting firmly on my daughter's shoulder, I looked straight at Erica and Daniel. My voice was calm, but it carried the kind of finality they couldn't ignore. No, Erica, I don't owe you a single thing. Not after the way you treated my daughter, not after the way you disrespected my home. This roof was a gift. You turned it into a weapon. And now, that weapon is gone. Enjoy figuring out what life looks like without me carrying you. The effect was instant. Erica's face collapsed, all the color draining as her lips trembled. She tried to speak, but only a strangled sound came out, her pride choking her before the words could. The woman who had strutted through my house like a queen now sat frozen in her chair, stripped of her crown, her eyes wide with humiliation and fear. Daniel lowered his gaze, fidgeting with his napkin like a schoolboy scolded in front of the class. But Erica, she looked like someone watching her castle crumble stone by stone, powerless to stop it. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply turned toward the hallway with my daughter, her smile quiet but radiant, while behind us the silence pressed down heavy on the ones who thought they had won. And in that moment, the victory was absolute. True strength doesn't always show itself in loud arguments or dramatic scenes. Sometimes it's in the quiet planning, the patience to wait, and the certainty to act when the time is right. I didn't win by shouting or demanding change. I won by preparing my next step in silence and following through with calm confidence. My story reminds us that generosity without boundaries often leads to being taken advantage of. But when you finally draw a line, you reclaim your dignity and protect what matters most. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free. Have you ever had to make a tough choice to protect your family's peace? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you handled a situation where someone tried to take advantage of your kindness.